I would never have believed any of this alien bullshit, but they changed my skin, and I have proof. Photographs of what I looked like before the abductions and what they returned me as. And a report from my dermatologist who has never encountered anything like this in his practice. This proves I'm not crazy. I'm not crazy. Not yet anyway. My name is Christine Parker. I'm 29, night shift nurse at Mercy General in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I grew up in a military family where my dad was stationed at Luke Air Force Base, and questioning everything was basically our religion. So when coworkers would talk about strange lights in the sky or weird experiences, I was always the one with the logical explanation. I had this dark brown birthmark under my left shoulder blade my whole life, size of a quarter. Doctors always said it was completely harmless. Mom used to joke it was my special mark. And until 2 years ago in February 2023, I lived a perfectly normal life working nights at the hospital because I was always a night owl and the pay was better and there was less drama from administration. Mercy General was dead quiet that February night, just me and Dr. Schmidt on duty with 3 patients sleeping in their rooms, and I was sitting at the nurse's station updating charts when sometime around 3 in the morning, this excruciating burning sensation exploded between my shoulder blades like someone had shoved a red-hot poker through my spine. I screamed and jumped up from my chair, but the pain only got worse, spreading across my back like acid, eating through my nerves, while this horrible, nauseating feeling washed over me like they inject anesthesia into your veins. That thick, drowsy sickness that makes your stomach turn and your head spin. My hands started shaking uncontrollably and my vision went white around the edges as this bone-deep humming sound vibrated through my skull like a drill boring into my brain, so I stumbled toward the window gasping for air, but what I saw outside made me collapse to my knees in terror. 3 lights in perfect triangular formation were descending toward the hospital, moving in complete silence. And the closer they got, the more the burning in my back intensified until I was sobbing and clawing at my uniform trying to reach the source of the agony. That sick, nauseating feeling became so overwhelming I started retching and dry heaving just as this massive triangular craft with a surface like living mercury settled right outside the 3rd floor window, and when I tried to crawl away from the glass, my entire body seized up in paralysis while waves of pure agony rolled through my nervous system. A beam of ice-cold blue light erupted from the craft's center, and when it hit me, I felt my consciousness being ripped apart like tissue paper, every nerve ending screaming as I was yanked through dimensions that shouldn't exist, while my body felt like it was being flayed alive. I came to strap down on something that pulsed like a heartbeat. Beneath me, thick restraints cutting into my wrists and ankles, while I realized with growing horror that I was completely naked and helpless under these blinding white lights that hurt to look at. The beings standing around me were nightmare fuel, 8 feet tall with gray skin that looked wet and diseased. Their massive heads bobbing on stick-thin necks while those huge black eyes stared down at me without a trace of emotion or mercy. When they moved, I could hear their joints clicking like insects and smell this chemical stench that made my stomach heave. And when one of them approached me with an instrument covered in needle-sharp protrusions, I started screaming until my throat was raw. The device made contact with my skin and the pain was indescribable, like being electrocuted from the inside, while thousands of tiny knives carved through my flesh, and I could feel them inserting things under my skin, threading wires through my nervous system while I thrashed against the restraints until my wrists bled. They worked on me for what felt like hours, taking samples and implanting devices while I begged them to stop, my voice breaking from screaming. And when one of them finally leaned over my face, I saw my own reflection in those dead black eyes, distorted and terrified and broken. Information flooded my brain like molten metal being poured into my skull, concepts about tracking and monitoring and harvest cycles that made me understand with crystalline clarity that this was just the beginning, that they owned me now. And then everything went black as my mind finally snapped from the overload. I woke up sprawled on the cold linoleum floor of the hospital corridor sometime around 5 in the morning, with hours of my life completely erased and blood dried under my fingernails that I couldn't remember getting there. My entire body felt like I'd been hit by a truck, every muscle screaming in agony. But it was my back that hurt worst of all, throbbing and burning like someone had used it as a cutting board. When I tried to stand, my legs gave out twice before I could get upright, and I noticed my uniform was torn in places I didn't remember tearing it, small rips around the shoulders and neck like something had grabbed me. That same nauseating feeling from before still churned in my stomach, making me gag repeatedly while I stumbled to the bathroom, like I was coming out of anesthesia but 1,000 times worse, and when I looked in the mirror I almost fainted because my eyes were bloodshot with burst vessels and there were finger-shaped bruises around my throat that definitely hadn't been there before my shift started. I stripped off my scrubs with shaking hands and twisted around to examine my back in the mirror, expecting to find some explanation for the pain, but my birthmark looked exactly the same as always. Dark brown and unremarkable, though the skin around it felt tender and hot to the touch like I'd been sunburned. The worst part was trying to remember what happened during those missing hours and coming up completely blank, except for flashes of images that felt more like nightmare fragments than real memories. Glimpses of bright lights and gray faces that made my heart race and my hands shake uncontrollably. Dr. Schmidt found me 20 minutes later, sitting on the bathroom floor crying, and when he asked what was wrong, I couldn't form coherent words. Just kept babbling about falling and hitting my head, even though there was no bump or cut anywhere on my skull. He wanted to send me home immediately, but I begged him to let me finish my shift because going back to my empty apartment felt impossible right then, like whatever had happened to me might happen again if I was alone. For the rest of that morning, I jumped at every sound and kept checking the windows obsessively, scanning the sky for lights that shouldn't be there while trying to convince myself I'd had some kind of psychotic break or seizure that explained the missing time and the physical symptoms. But deep down in a place I didn't want to acknowledge, I knew something had been done to me. Something that left me feeling violated in ways I couldn't articulate, like my body wasn't entirely my own anymore and every shadow might be hiding something waiting to take me again. For the next 2 weeks, I felt like death, my body completely falling apart in ways I couldn't explain to anyone, including myself. First, I lost my sense of smell completely. Coffee that I used to love tasted like dirty water. Food had no flavor at all, like someone had sucked all the life out of everything I put in my mouth. Then came the fever that wouldn't break, sweating through sheets every night while these horrific nightmares played on repeat in my head. Always the same flashes of gray faces and cold hands that left me screaming myself awake. My temperature spiked to 102 degrees and stayed there for days, so I finally dragged myself to the clinic where Dr. Robinson took one look at me and immediately started listing off COVID symptoms. The psychological effects, loss of taste and smell, persistent fever, it all matched perfectly, and for a moment I felt relieved that there might be a logical explanation for what was happening to me. We did the PCR test, and I waited 3 days for results, praying it would come back positive because that would mean I wasn't going crazy. But when the test came back negative, Dr. Robinson ordered extensive blood work and told me I'd have to wait at least a week for those results, maybe longer if they needed to send samples to specialized labs. Living alone became impossible after that. Every shadow in my apartment looked like something waiting to grab me, and the silence at night was so thick I could barely breathe through it. One Tuesday around midnight, I had such a severe panic attack that I couldn't stop shaking or catch my breath, so I called Helen, my college roommate, sobbing into the phone until she agreed to drive over and stay the night. Having her there helped at first. We made tea and talked about normal things like her job and her boyfriend drama, but then she suggested we watch a movie to take my mind off everything, and picked this horror film that had these creatures with impossibly long fingers reaching through walls. The moment I saw those elongated digits stretching across the screen, I started screaming uncontrollably, tears pouring down my face while my whole body shook with terror I couldn't explain. Helen turned off the movie immediately and held me while I sobbed, and the next morning she made me promise to call a therapist that very day, literally standing over me while I dialed the number and made an appointment. Dr. Sarah Chen had kind eyes and a calm voice that made me feel safe enough to tell her about the blackout at work, how I'd lost several hours and woken up on the floor with unexplained bruises, and this overwhelming sense that something terrible had happened to me. I kept the details vague, just said I'd had some kind of fainting episode followed by severe anxiety and panic attacks triggered by specific images like long fingers or bright lights, anything that reminded me of those nightmare fragments I couldn't quite remember. She listened without judgment while I described the insomnia, the paranoia, the way certain sounds made my skin crawl like nails on a chalkboard, and when I finished, she nodded sympathetically and explained that trauma can manifest in mysterious ways even when we can't consciously recall what happened. She prescribed lorazepam to help with the panic attacks and recommended I start coming twice a week until we could work through whatever was causing these episodes, and for the first time in weeks I felt like maybe I wasn't completely losing my mind. 3 weeks into therapy, Helen kept insisting I needed to get back to normal life and start dating again, reminding me that Thomas from the hospital lab had been asking about me for months and I'd always been too busy with work to give him a chance. He was sweet, one of those genuinely nice guys who brought me coffee during late shifts and always asked how my day was going, like he actually cared about the answer. So, when Helen literally grabbed my phone and threatened to call him herself, I finally dialed his number. He didn't pick up, so I left a rambling voicemail saying I was feeling better now, and if he was still interested, maybe we could grab dinner sometime, then immediately regretted how desperate I probably sounded. But then something horrible happened. This evening I decided to take a hot shower to calm my nerves, but halfway through washing my hair, the bathroom started spinning, and my legs gave out completely, sending me crashing forward into the tile wall where my forehead connected with a sickening crack. Blood immediately started pouring down my face from what felt like a deep gash, and I could see myself in the bathroom mirror, crimson streams running into my eyes while the world went dark around the edges. The last thing I remember was sliding down the shower wall, leaving a red smear on the white tiles before everything went black. I came to in complete darkness, my naked body strapped vertically against some kind of warm wall with my head locked in place so tightly I couldn't turn it even an inch. The air was stifling hot and humid, like being inside someone's mouth, and I realized with growing horror that I was completely exposed and helpless while something moved in the shadows just beyond my vision. A thin figure approached slowly, easily 8 feet tall, with limbs that seemed too long for its frame, and I felt those cold fingers begin exploring my body from my ankles up to my thighs with clinical detachment. The pressure in my bladder was unbearable. I was fighting not to wet myself right there while these hands continued their examination, touching me everywhere with complete disregard for my humanity or dignity. Suddenly, blinding white light exploded around me, and the pain in my skull became so intense I thought my head might actually split open while my entire body convulsed with adrenaline and terror. I was sweating so profusely it felt like breaking a fever, the heat making it impossible to breathe while every nerve in my body screamed in agony, and then everything went black again. The sound of my phone ringing dragged me back to consciousness, and I jerked upright in the shower, immediately slipping on what looked like a pool of my own blood that had collected on the bathroom floor. I scrambled to my feet in absolute terror, staring at the dark red puddle, then rushing to check myself in the mirror, but my forehead was completely intact without even a scratch where I was sure I'd split it open. I quickly grabbed a towel to wipe the blood off my feet and ran to answer the phone, heart pounding as Thomas's cheerful voice asked if I'd gotten his message about plans for the weekend. 3 days had passed since the bathroom incident, and I felt incredible, like someone had replaced my broken body with a brand new one that actually functioned properly. No fever, no nightmares, no anxiety, just this strange sense of well-being that I hadn't experienced in months. I couldn't figure out where all that blood had come from since my period wasn't due for another 2 weeks, and the vivid dream I'd had while unconscious felt too real to be just a side effect of the tranquilizers. Could those creatures have actually healed my head injury and gotten rid of my symptoms? But that was insane. Why would they help me? Out of pity, or because they still needed me alive for something? I pushed those thoughts away and focused on getting ready for dinner with Thomas, choosing a black dress with an open back and a warm winter coat. At the restaurant, Thomas helped me out of my coat and immediately noticed my birthmark, commenting on how unusual it looked, so perfectly round and even like someone had drawn it on with a marker. When he asked if he could touch it, I giggled and said sure, but the moment his finger made contact, we both felt a small electric shock. Nothing dangerous, just stronger than the usual static electricity people sometimes share. I joked that I'd started generating my own power after the electric company raised their rates, and we both laughed it off. After dinner, we walked outside and looked up at the sky, lamenting how city lights made it impossible to see stars except for one bright point of light directly overhead. Thomas said he believed in UFOs while I insisted it was probably just Venus and that I preferred to trust science and astronomy over speculation. His romantic enthusiasm was endearing though, and we ended up back at my apartment where I slept better than I had in months. The next morning, Dr. Robinson called, sounding panicked, asking me to come to the clinic immediately because my blood work showed abnormalities he'd never seen in 20 years of practice. When I arrived, he had papers spread across his desk and explained that my blood contained cellular structures that didn't match any known human variants, along with trace elements that shouldn't exist in the human body. He needed me to sign consent forms, allowing him to send samples to a specialized research laboratory because whatever was in my bloodstream was completely unprecedented, and while he tried to reassure me that I seemed healthy, his worried expression told me this was far from normal. 6 months later, I thought the worst was behind me. Thomas and I were getting serious, and I'd convinced myself those episodes were just stress-related blackouts until the night I woke up at 3 a.m. completely paralyzed in my own bed with that familiar burning sensation spreading across my back. The beam of light came through my bedroom window this time, that same cold blue radiance that made my skin feel like it was being peeled away layer by layer, and within seconds I was floating upward through the ceiling as if it didn't exist. They placed me on that warm, pulsing surface again, but this time, the restraints felt different, softer somehow, and instead of the harsh white lights, there was this gentle amber glow that didn't hurt my eyes. The tall gray figure approached me with something that looked like a scanner, running it slowly over every inch of my body while I felt this strange tingling sensation wherever the device touched me. Then came the part I can barely bring myself to describe, how they positioned me differently this time. More intimately, while multiple beings worked around me with instruments that seemed designed for collection rather than examination. The whole procedure felt invasive in ways that made me burn with shame. Not painful like before, but deeply violating as they gathered samples from places that made me want to die from humiliation. I could feel them working between my thighs with delicate precision while tears streamed down my face, and when they finally turned their attention to my back, I felt that familiar burning as they did something to my birthmark, some kind of extraction that left the area numb and cold. The amber light grew brighter and brighter until everything dissolved into that warm floating sensation, and when I woke up in my bed the next morning, I knew, without looking, that something fundamental about me had changed forever. The next morning, I woke up feeling incredibly aroused, my body humming with energy that demanded release, and when Thomas and I were making love, he suddenly stopped moving and pulled back, staring at my shoulder blade with complete shock, asking what happened to my birthmark because the dark brown spot that had been there my entire life had vanished completely overnight. I felt sick with panic, realizing that something inside me was fundamentally different now, that whatever they'd done during that last encounter had changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. I spent hours searching online for cases of birthmarks disappearing, but found nothing that matched my situation, and 3 days later, when I spotted a woman downtown with an identical mark on her forearm, I knew I had to reach her. My heart was pounding as I ran across the street dodging traffic because I desperately needed to know if she was experiencing the same impossible things I was, if she'd also lost time or had strange dreams or felt like her body wasn't entirely her own anymore. She turned the corner just as I reached the sidewalk, and when I rounded the building, she was gone, vanished like she'd never existed at all. The weeks that followed felt unnaturally peaceful, but underneath that calm, I sensed something growing inside me, changing me from within. When the nausea finally hit, I rushed to Dr. Robinson, who seemed terrified when he told me my previous blood samples had disappeared from the government lab, and on the drive home, I started hearing this ethereal melody in my head while my sense of smell became so acute I could detect individual ingredients in restaurant kitchens from blocks away. The next morning, his call came at exactly 7 a.m. "Congratulations, Christine. You're pregnant, but we need to talk immediately."